I want to welcome everybody to our third Paul Farmer Collaborative Global Surgery Research Seminar. We're excited today to have a session focused on telesurgery in global surgery. Just a little bit about the seminar. The Paul Farmer Collaborative Global Surgery Research Seminar has been co-sponsored by the Center for Equity in Global Surgery at the University of Global Health Equity and the Program in Global Surgery and Social Change at Harvard Medical School. This is going to be a 5-session series, so this is the third in the 5 sessions that explores methods and outcomes in global surgery research. You'll see from today's format that each session will have 2 speakers speaking on similar topics. And so the format today will be the brief introduction by me. And I realize I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bethany Heck-Gauthier. I am a co-director of research for PGSSC Research Pillar. So after my brief introduction, I'll introduce our 2 speakers, each of which will present for about 20 minutes. And then we'll open it up at the end for a robust discussion about each of the papers together. At the end of the seminar, we will be posting the videos online. We can share that link with you at the end of the seminar as well, where you can watch the previous 2 sessions. I want to acknowledge the team that works hard to make sure that this seminar goes off without a hitch, including my co-faculty leads, Adam Blatten and Paret Mukundwa, and then also to recognize the various trainees and junior researchers in our group who really have made this a success. In the chat, you should be getting a link to the Mentimeter poll, but for those of you who might be joining in a group setting, you can scan this QR link, and want to encourage Taylor Afford to also post this in the chat. So every month when we have the seminar, we encourage colleagues to tell us where they're calling in from, and we'll share that map with you at the end of the call, but it really is amazing to see how a virtual seminar can pull in people from around the world. So without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker. Dr. Shadi Saikali is a senior clinical fellow specializing in robotic and minimally invasive urologic surgery. He pursued his medical studies and his residency at the Lebanese American University in Beirut. Dr. Saikali has developed expertise in cutting-edge robotic and robotic prostate surgery techniques and has focused a lot of his research in telesurgery innovation and artificial intelligence. He has co-authored several publications on the technical and ethical requirements for establishing safe and effective telesurgery, contributing to the dialogue on surgical advancements alongside key figures in robotic surgeries and telecommunications. Dr. Sakali has also played an instrumental role in co-founding a collaborative community website that fosters cross-disciplinary discussions among stakeholders in the telesurgery field, as well as robotic surgery and surgical AI. He is an AI enthusiast involved in multiple research projects pertaining to machine learning, computer vision, and clinical outcomes in prostate cancer. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today, and I'll turn over the screen sharing to you.
All right. Thank you so much for that great introduction, Bethany. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming today. This is really a privilege to be able to talk about what we do, explain basically where we are in terms of telesurgery, how far we've gone, and where we're going to get to in the future. So thank you all. This is a great initiative. And so yeah, without further ado, so we published recently an article entitled Telesurgery, the Humanitarian and Surgical Benefits while Navigating Technological and Administrative Challenges. So this was an article based off an original one that we had, which talked about the technical and ethical considerations in telesurgery, where we were able to discuss a lot of the broader topics. But this is one focused more on how are we able to basically deliver equitable surgical care to patients and at the same time in a technically feasible manner without compromising any ethical standards. So first of all, just to introduce who we are. Here in Advent Health in the Global Robotic Institute, it's an institute established by Dr. Vipul Patel that provides excellence in technology and surgical technique, mainly in urological cancers and prostate cancer surgery. There are other specialties with other attendings involved. We've had over 20 fellows from different countries that have graduated the fellowship here and over the last almost 20 years. We do have the largest volume of robotic radical prostatectomies. We just finished our 19,000 actually, and we're encroaching on 20,000 by the end of this year of robotic prostatectomies. And we have a prospectively kept database of outcomes on these patients. And after realizing that we have such large volumes, we want to try and Dr. Patel's initiative was to dissipate this knowledge, to try and spread expert care to the rest of the world. Um, so how did telesurgery actually start, the concept? The initial purpose was to build robotic surgical systems initially in the 90s. I think it was a DARPA project, the Department of Defense. They wanted to build surgical robots that could be deployed anywhere safely and perform surgery. That was the initial concept of robotic surgery, is to basically telesurgery. So a surgeon would be somewhere that deploy the robot to the battlefield that can operate on this injured soldiers or casualties from afar. So that was the initial concept. Now, that's not how it started off in the end. So the robotic consoles were made initially before Da Vinci to be able to be used locally in the operating room. So for the first 10, 15 years probably of robotic consoles, there was no telesurgery involved. Then around the late 90s, some small experiments with procedures that could be done remotely, such as percutaneous access or access to the kidney through the skin or anything like that, were trialed out in different institutions, such as Johns Hopkins and other places around the world. But the real big shift or the real big milestone achievement was Professor Marisco in France. He performed what was called a Lindbergh operation, and that was basically a robotic cholecystectomy, removal of the gallbladder. And the patient was in France while Dr. Marisco was in New York. And they were able to successfully remove the cholecystectomy without any glitches in the surgery. And this was done in September 2001. They were able to remove it and there was no issues. I think France Telecom at the time laid down a fiber optic cable from New York to France. So you can imagine the incredible costs. I think it cost close to $1 million for the procedure at the time. And since then, there have been other notable examples, such as in Canada, Dr. Anvari spearheaded a general surgery telesurgical program where he had two different hospitals he was connected to and performed bariatric and general surgery procedures there. Underwater medical interventions were tried out with NASA, as well as within China, most recently, performing telesurgical procedures. So when we look at why we think telesurgery is necessary at this point, this is the global distribution of surgeons, and the darker green colors are where the highest density of them are, and the lighter colors are where the lowest density are. When you look at per 100,000 population, if you look at Africa, for example, you rarely have 1 to 20, maybe there are some countries that have, maybe Egypt is the only one that has between 50 and 40 surgeons for 100,000 people. When you look at places like Angola and other places, it's less than 1 or less than 2 sometimes. While when you look at places like Central Europe, like here in France and the UK and the US, between 60 and 100 surgeons per 100,000 people. And it's not just surgeons, anesthesiologists, OBGYN. So there is a global lack of surgeons per population, as well as an uneven and unequal distribution of them. When you look at the global need, it's basically a mirror image of what the global distribution of surgeons is. As you can see, the darker portions are the proportion of the populations that don't have any access or access to expert surgical care, or any access to adequate surgical care at the moment. So that's where we see the actual market, or not really, market's probably not the right word, but the actual need for telesurgery at the moment. So telesurgery is providing surgical expertise from a remote geographical location. So the patient would be in one area or one country or one state, and the surgeon would be in another. And this is, like we said, the initial concept of why robotic surgery was developed. And we find the pertinence of it basically mainly related to surgical education. It allows urgent intervention for some cases. Most likely, that's where we think the first approvals for telesurgery will happen, for neurological stroke cases, probably cardiac interventions, things where you don't have enough expert physicians or trained physicians to perform these procedures. And I know within the US, after we've been researching and talking to different neurointerventionists, is that there isn't really a good, an adequate distribution of neurointerventionists around the US, where some people that could suffer a stroke are probably over an hour away from the nearest center that could actually revascularize the brain. And as you know, time is money when it comes to strokes. Time is brain, and time is money as it comes to strokes. So we can't leave these patients more than an hour from door to intervention time. Also, clinical observerships where patients and can be operated on and by their normal surgeons, the regular surgeons, and then remote surgeons can chime in and try and understand what's going on. We saw the real benefit of remote medical treatment and remote medical consultations during COVID, and that's when I think the concept of revisiting telesurgery came about when you look at the timings of the recent publications. So where is the potential humanitarian benefit of telesurgery? We see it basically in looking at healthcare equity via, first of all, surgical training and innovation. And I'm sure later on the next discussion, we'll discuss more about proctoring. We also want to expand the access to specialized care. So we don't want to limit it to just where you are geographically. If you can spread it across geographical borders, why not? As long as technology allows for it. We want to reduce that geographic disparity that we saw in the initial slides, trying to make all the colors look equal as much as possible around, or the different shades of colors look equal across the globe if possible. There is a potential for cost reductions because you don't have to deploy as many devices in every single center. It's no longer needed that you have the full device. You can have a part of it, one in one center and the central hub in another that can operate on them. Instead of flying surgeons out or flying patients out, everything can be done while everyone's in their natural habitat, natural ecosystem of working environment. We'd also want to enhance surgical training and collaboration. This seems like the fastest way to continue surgical training after graduation. If people have complex cases, a lot of surgeons I've talked to, expert surgeons, have discussed how their younger trainees after graduation always wish that they were just there over their shoulder, coaching them through one of the complex cases they do. And this is where telesurgery could definitely be useful. If we look at the impact of telesurgery on global health, it's the main concept of it, or the main benefit, is to bridge that gap, bringing the surgical expertise, which are concentrated in metropolis or large cities, and bringing them to rural and underserved communities that really need them without the need for travel, whether on the patient side or the surgeon side. And we have to look at how telesurgery can also improve patient outcomes in various regions. So by bridging the gaps, these patients are able to benefit from surgical expertise that they wouldn't have otherwise. And also opens up the opportunity for global collaborations, opportunities for international mentorship, trainings, and cross-border partnerships between different institutions and surgeons, allowing for the dissemination of this knowledge. What are the challenges, though, when we researched this and looked at what's going on and what could be the obstacles after talking to experts? What are the challenges in implementing telesurgery? Obviously, the main obvious one are the technical challenges, latency issues when you're performing surgery, making sure there's the adequate data transfer securely across networks from one area to the other, as well as the reliability of this equipment. So making sure the equipment is built robustly enough to allow for telesurgical procedures without any glitches. Because you can imagine these high equity environments, you can't really afford glitches in these, or at least if there is no escape from them, you have a redundant connection or redundant form of being able to perform the surgery locally. The infrastructure requirements, the need for reliable high-speed internet and advanced telerobotics, the systems that are actually being used or the robots being used have to be compatible and have to be able to absorb and be able to perform these surgeries at a very high standard without any glitches, as we said. But also what's we think is probably the most important part of this are the ethical and legal considerations involved. Patient consent, data security, data transfer security, as well as what are the cross-border medical laws that govern who is responsible for the patient, and if something were to happen later on, who is responsible would be responsible for the complications. When we look at the humanitarian benefits, just looking at the numbers alone, 18 million people, or 18 million additional healthcare workers, are needed to achieve universal healthcare coverage by 2030. And 19% of the world's surgeons are just available in low-income countries, which is home to almost half of the world's population, which could create some form of health injustice. This is where we discussed that telesurgery could come in and allow for global equity. whether we use them in war zones, in extreme environments, in rural underserved areas, whatever it is, it will definitely help a lot on the humanitarian front. The surgical benefits, like we discussed, it's looking at expert care to places that lack expert care. It's going to enhance patient outcomes. Dr. Andrew Hung, who's a urologist, he's based out of Cedars-Sinai. He's an AI enthusiast, but he published a paper on telesurgery and telementoring. And basically, he looked at the four main forms, starting with verbal guidance, going to telestration, where you demonstrate remotely what's going on, virtually teleassist someone who would need it, and then the final form will culminate in performing the surgery remotely completely by the expert if need be. And it's a very interesting paper where it shows the evolution from one form, a more basic form, which is verbal guidance, which is probably doesn't really need much um, technical requirements. However, you get to telesurgery where technical requirements are basically vital for its success. So the technical considerations, when we look at the first surgery done in 2001, large strides have been accomplished here. So when you look at latency and data transmission, what we need are low latency, high bandwidths for safety and efficiency. And what we need are numbers. So these are great in concepts. What are the numbers? So when we look at most of the studies, they say if you can get the latency down to 100 milliseconds round trip, then you're working in a very safe environment that is not perceptible to the surgeon. So they can't really perceive the latency in less than 100 milliseconds round trip. So 50 milliseconds each way. As well as you ensure high bandwidth because you need visual and audio data to be transferred very, very safely and high accuracy. 5G seems to be the solution to this, as when you look at the Internet of Things that's been being the term that's being thrown around, there's the Internet of Service, which is supposed to be the next generation, where you actually provide services over the internet, such as telesurgery, being one of them, among others. And the 5G itself being able to be distributed quickly and obviously cheaper than fiber optics seems to be the solution. Right now, it's not evenly distributed, where the US and China hold over 80% of the global 5G distribution. So trying to distribute it equally should be the key focus of technical considerations. And you also want to make sure the robotic platforms are compatible. We've always had the Da Vinci robot for 20 plus years. Over the last 5, 6 years, Da Vinci lost their patent for just robotics. So a lot of new companies have emerged, mainly in China. And the Chinese companies that build robots, a lot of their marketing strategy focuses on the fact that they are telesurgery capable. And we've used those robots and seen them demonstrated. And we've actually performed telesurgery in China and some other places. We'll show you the videos in a second, where they actually work. When you ask the surgeon performing, Dr. Patel tells you, I can't perceive the difference, like when it's that close. However, it wasn't always on 5G, sometimes on fiber optics. Patients were thousands of kilometers away, and he couldn't really perceive the difference there. There are many solutions proposed, especially with the future Gs. So 6G and 7G later on down the road, with the increased bandwidth and speed, they expect that to help tremendously in providing excellent and efficient care. So we have to make sure that HIPAA and GDPR in Europe must be upheld at all costs. We have to oversee the regulatory bodies should be in place. Cybersecurity and preventing malicious attacks obviously is something else we'd worry about in this environment. There are preventive measures that have been discussed at length for man-in-the-middle attacks and denial-of-service attacks, but those are definitely more important than remedial ones. So we don't want the attack to happen, we want to prevent it. So device authentication, multiple encryption levels really comes in here as the way to prevent these attacks from happening, as well as allowing for device interoperability. We want one platform to talk to another. So we don't want both robots should not have to be the same on the patient end and the surgeon end. We should have some ability to use two different companies, just like one phone company talk to another. It doesn't have to be two iPhones or two Androids or whatever it is that are talking to each other. We need multiple to allow for patients or hospitals that can't afford anything more than that. And also, like we said, the most important part, we think, is the ethical part. We're worried about the impact on surgeon-patient relationship. We don't want the actual procedure to take precedence over this treating the patient. Here we think that transparent and communication between the surgeon and the patient, the remote one included, before the surgery is really key. We also need to look at the potential for dehumanizing and patient objectification. So prioritizing patient-centered care really makes this or propels this forward and ensures this not occurring. And you need to recognize every patient's unique journey in this. It can't just be every patient's the same and it's a telesurgical procedure and let's just do it. We also have to acknowledge patient vulnerability. The informed consent must be clear on what's going on and who will be held responsible. Any conflicts of interest must be avoided, obviously, in this matter, in the whole telesurgical procedure. And there are a lot of legal concerns and responsibilities that also must be predefined. So cross-border litigation concerns must be addressed before performing the surgery itself. It shouldn't be something that should be treated and after the fact. And what are the future considerations that we think might help? Looking at AI, obviously, the big buzzword everyone's been using. Looking at AI and overcoming obstacles, it could reduce latency, enhance precision, and allow assessment of training skills. Augmented and virtual reality to overcome any delays or any glitches in data transmission, especially visual data, and also predicting surgeon motion. And this is something that we don't have yet, but I'm sure within the next 10 years, it's something we're trying to achieve, as well as haptic feedback, which is very minimal on robotic consoles now, but being able to feel what's going on through the console would probably add a huge extra dimension to the procedure. So in theory, these are different papers. These are some of the ones we've talked about, looking at animal models. We've done animal experiments. We've done a systematic review. We've looked at different things in terms of what are the different aspects and looking at telesurgery from different perspectives. The reality is the reality is actually performing the surgery. So here, Dr. Patel is performing kidney surgery within China. I think this was an animal model, though. He was able to perform the surgery. The latency was 20 to 40 milliseconds. It was on a 5G local network. It was a dedicated network, however, and the difference between surgeon and patient was 1,200 kilometers. When we look here, this is an animal trial we performed between Orlando and China. It was around 13,000 kilometers. This is an animal model here. The surgeon was in Orlando, the pig was in China, and we performed a nephrectomy very safely on the patient, on the pig, and there was no actual blood loss or anything like that, just as if it was done here. Obviously, you had to account for latency, but the surgeon had to account for latency, but it went pretty smoothly. Here, we've also connected our console to Dubai, to one of the showrooms, and performed some suturing techniques on a turkey leg, just to show that the connection is viable. And the most recent project Dr. Patel has embarked on is trying to implement robotic surgery in general in Angola. And they've just bought the first 3 robots ever. They went from open surgery to robotic. They've never done laparoscopy. And this is Dr. Patel performing surgery where he's in one building and the robot's in another, and he's doing a prostatectomy on a patient. And as you can see here, the console here is empty. He's in another one while the surgery here is ongoing. And this is one of our assistants, and that's our team performing the surgery on the patient. This is the setup. Dr. Patel was in another area over here while the patient was in a different room. And this is actually helping achieve global surgical equity is the key here. What we're trying to do is trying to spread surgical expertise as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And that's the point of telesurgery, really. It's not just to do it because we can do it. It's to do it to be able to benefit as many people as possible in the most efficient timeline. And the only way this can work is if it's a collaborative community. You have robotic companies involved, medical society, patient advocates, cybersecurity experts. All of these people have to come together and discuss what is in the best interest of the patient in the most efficient, technically feasible manner. So in February 2024, we got 200 invited speakers came together in Orlando when we formed the telesurgery working group. And there was 14 society presidents, 40 heads of department, 2 ministers of health, the White House and representative, World Bank, FDA. All these people came together over a weekend, and we discussed what are the implications and what are the things that need to be focused on to be able to achieve telesurgery globally. So finally, I'm probably a few minutes over time, I apologize. These are the take-home messages. Telesurgery has grown substantially throughout the years. Starting in 2001, now it's in a different area and different technical background altogether. It does face significant technological challenges, including data transmission, like we discussed. 5G networks and 5G coverage are the mainstay of trying to promote this. Ethical considerations are still pivotal, and you really need the most attention in this before we can move forward. But as telesurgery progresses, integrating AI, augmented reality, and haptic feedback really holds the promise for further advancements. And this was after they finished their first remote prostate surgery in China. One of our assistants was at the patient's bed, 3,000 kilometers away, ready to jump in if anything happened. And Dr. Patel was somewhere else. And yeah, so we have to work together in a collaborative community to be able to achieve the goal of safe and equitable telesurgery. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I already see some questions coming in on the chat and encourage everyone to continue to think about your questions, make note of them, and we'll open it up for a robust discussion after our next presenter. As we transition to the next presenter, I do just want to remind everyone that we are trying to document where folks are calling in from. So please, if you have not already, either go to the link by this QR code, or someone will post in the chat where the link that you can access from your computer, and just let us know where you're joining us from, and we'll share that with you at the end of the session. So I'm pleased to welcome our next speaker. Dr. Linda Zhang is an associate professor in the Department of Surgery at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, specializing in complex hernia repair, bariatric surgery, and robotic surgery. In her leadership role as the Director of Global Surgery, she manages global health initiatives and organizes international surgical rotations for residents. As the chair of Global Affairs Committee and a board member of the Society of American Gastrointestinal and Endoscopic Surgeons, she has been a tireless advocate for the standardization and validation of laparoscopic skills, particularly in low and middle income countries. Dr. Zhang has also played a pivotal role in the establishment of the Chayabirwa Surgical Center, an ambulatory surgical facility in rural Uganda. Dr. Zhang's research focuses on global surgery and surgical education. Among other grants, she received the SAGE Research Grant in 2023, which funds her work on implementing a standardized laparoscopic training program across Africa to strengthen skills for surgeons in LMICs. Dr. Zhang, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for, oh, somehow I cannot share. It says sharing is not turned on.
We try it again now.
Okay. There we go. Great. Thank you. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to share what we have done at Mount Sinai and as SAGES with everyone here. It is really a privilege. I am amazed at the number of people who are signed up for this. I've always wanted to learn a lot more about the Power Farmer Collaborative. So I will get started. So I'll be talking about remote training and teleproctoring for surgeons in low resource areas. I'll speak a little first about the challenges of both laparoscopic and endoscopic training in LMICs, then move on to telesimulation and then teleproctoring. I know I'm speaking to a group of pros at understanding the barriers to surgical care and the need for surgical training. So I will skip that part and go straight to laparoscopic training. The adoption of laparoscopy in low middle income countries, it is really based and it really requires all these components to be in place. Laparoscopic equipment, having surgeons, trainers, having training programs in the simulation lab, and then institutional support and bioengineering and also ancillary staff training. The only one that is always already there is the demand for laparoscopy from patients. It doesn't really matter where you go, the people have heard of it and they understand the benefits of it, but it's all the other boxes on this image that really requires a lot of expertise and a lot of support. And obviously the outcome is that we want to try and improve patient care. So I'm mainly going to talk about the surgeon trainer and training program and simulation lab portion of this diagram. As we all know, there's a lot of barriers to laparoscopic training in low resource settings. There's a lack of local experts to do the training, and there's a lack of expert trainers as a result of that. There's insufficient training opportunities, and the cost of training can be extremely high, especially in the African continent. There are very few training opportunities, and most surgeons either have to go travel outside of their country to a neighboring country or to the most popular places, India, to get their training as like an observership where they're not really operating either. And then eventually, after a few weeks or a couple months, they go back, and if the opportunity arises, then they actually say that they're a laparoscopic surgeon and start performing in patients, which sounds like a very scary idea. The current state of laparoscopic training is also very limited. People have, as I said, varying experiences. Those who can't afford it would travel abroad to get that exposure. Others would just sort of do a lot of apprenticeship kind of training where they latch on to a surgeon either at their own institution or a nearby institution and observe and participate in some of the laparoscopic cases and learn by watching or doing some being an assistant in the cases. There are no defined curriculums, and there is certainly a very limited venue for laparoscopic skills certification. So this is, I think, where telesimulation really comes in, and I argue that this really is the future of surgical training in global surgery, where it's an intersect between simulation-based education, telesimulation, and telementorship. As here, we in the US, we all know the benefits of simulation-based education. It's ideal for a lot of advanced surgical skills training, and it helps in terms of providing access to a scary environment where people can practice their skills repeatedly with guidance from a mentor and perfect their skills before they need to use them in the operating room. And this can really be the future for surgical education in low resource areas. Telesimulation is the tele version of simulation, where the simulation sessions are remotely proctored as opposed to having someone there. And the advantage is that it is simple and feasible over very basic systems like Zoom. It's less costly than on-site training. And this is what I think is the most important part, which is that sessions are really spread over a longer period of time. So you get these spaced repetition that is much better, and studies have shown that is much better than having a extended period of time like that is like a 1 week course or a 2-day course where you're repeatedly doing the same things over and over again. This spaced bursts of repetition is much better. However, the challenge is that the local site does need to have very good internet access. They need to have some kind of a web-based platform, which these days is actually not too difficult. And most people, they all have a cell phone. Some may have a tablet that they can use as the transmission device. And this, I think, is the harder part, which is that both the expert trainers and the participants really need to be committed to this process of being engaged over long periods of time and staying on and watching the participants' skills improve over time. So I just wanted to give 2 examples of telesimulation. One is done at Mount Sinai's site in Uganda, which is called Chibera Surgical Center. This was a center that was built in 2019, and the goal is to bridge the gap of access to surgical care. It is located about 4 hours from Kampala, the capital, in a very rural area of Uganda. And let's see. It is fully operated by Ugandans, so there are no foreign entities on site. They have one surgeon, 3 medical officers, one anesthesiologist, 2 CRNAs, and 15 nurses. And it has expanded pretty quickly, and now they have over 70 employees at the site. And they do a significant amount of local outreach and a recovering at home kind of program where nurses go out into the community to see patients as opposed to having them come to the facility, just because many patients are located very far away, and to make it easier for them to get access to surgical care. And at this point, we have done over 1,500 cases per year. Majority of it is an ambulatory surgery center, so majority of the cases are very sort of low acuity hernias and excisions and some urological cases. There's a lot of endoscopy happening at this point. And at this point, we also do laparoscopy, as I will talk about in a little bit. So here is just to give you an example, and this we don't have to play this, but as an example of how telesimulation occurred, this is Dr. Joseph, our surgeon over there. This was actually from, I think at this point, 3 years ago, when we first introduced laparoscopy over there, and he started learning laparoscopic skills. So we would spend an hour or two once in a while, whenever he had time, to practice on the FLS box and practice his laparoscopic skills. And I mean, as you can all imagine, I think we're all experts of Zoom at this point, that this is pretty straightforward. And it doesn't require much. And the setup is very easy.
Dr. Zhang, we're starting to lose the continuity of your talking. I don't know if it's the video playing or not.
Yeah, sorry. I am unfortunately at a conference in California, so I'm using the hotel internet, so it may be a little slow. Sorry about that. But just let me know, and I can.
It's working now, so let's
Yeah,
keep
I think it's the
going.
video.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe when we play the video, I'll turn off my camera, and hopefully that'll speed things up a little. Okay. The other example that I want to give is what we are doing at SAGES, which is you guys may know, it's a laparoscopic surgical society in the US. And we have an arm that specifically targets training for laparoscopy for surgeons in low income areas. So our approach is that we actually have a 4 to 6 month virtual component where we do telesimulation, and with our participants in the select country before we get on site for a local on-site course that's 5 days. And by doing this way, we really
I think we've lost audio again, so let's just, if we can give her a minute to just.
where everyone. Can you hear
Sorry,
me?
your audio went out again, so I don't, maybe turn off the video for just the next chunk of the presentation and see if the internet comes back for you.
Okay, sorry. You can probably hear me. Let me also turn off my my video. Okay.
We can hear you now.
So
Thank you.
yeah, great. Okay. So we have these sessions in Costa Rica and Mexico, as well as El Salvador, and out in Africa, we have them as asynchronous, where we have virtual sessions for the lectures, but for the telesimulation part, because their internet is not great, as it is not in California right now, we can't do these sessions live. So they actually practice at their homes, and then they upload the videos onto WhatsApp groups, and then we give them feedback that way. The nice thing about this, obviously, is that you do get instant feedback and exactly what it is that they need to correct. So I think I mentioned this already. These are the current sites that we have done virtual courses in over the last 2 years. And we published some of our data on this virtual platform, and we did some very basic tasks with the participants. They're all FLS tasks before and after, and obviously with practice, the task skills time decreased. But more importantly, many of the participants thought that this was a good use of their time and that it was easily reproducible. And what they really liked about it was the practice sessions as opposed to the lectures, which again is not surprising. People always love hands-on learning. And then the guidance and the feedback is what they really liked. Teleproctoring is essentially just the next step to this, where you are doing real-time remote supervision by an expert surgeon. And it's best done for laparoscopic, endoscopic, or robotic surgery, as my previous lecturers mentioned. And because of the optics and the mechanized instruments that are being used, the advantage is that you get the expert guidance. It decreases the cost of lab training, and you can integrate it into the surgeon's routine practice. You develop this long-term collaborative relationship, just like as in telesimulation. It can be reducible, and certainly research has shown that there is plenty of safety, and it's just as effective as on-site training. Of course, again, the limitations are the internet bandwidth, as we've both previously mentioned. There is maybe some latency, perhaps not as important as in robotic telesurgery. And there's a lot of time commitment on both sides in order to establish that long-term requirement, a long-term relationship. And plus, there's a bit of a tedious initial setup to ensure that the connection works. So here is a teleproctored laparoscopic surgery that is done. This is Dr. Heron from Mount Sinai, and he's in his office. And these two images our views are from Chibera, where there is an outside view of where the ports are and where the camera and the instruments are being used. And then there's an inside view. Able to watch it. So this is a lap appy that they're doing. So this is sort of almost the same as if you were training a resident in your own OR, right? You're just giving verbal cues and verbal advices on what to do. The only difference is if they really cannot do it, you can't reach over and do it for them. So that's really the only difference between teleproctoring and regular proctoring in our own ORs. And the nice thing about this in terms of safety is that Dr. Joseph is a very experienced surgeon in general. So if he really cannot do it, then he would just do an open appy, which is what he normally does anyways, which is different from training trainees who don't have a plan B if you can't do it, if you're not there. So we did publish a bit on this as well, and essentially in between the 3 years that before we published this, we did 61 teleproctored laparoscopic surgeries, mainly appendectomies and cholecystectomies. And at this point, Dr. Joseph is a very proficient laparoscopic surgeon, but we still watch him actually, and he still invites us for all of his laparoscopic cases, and we still give him suggestions. So he gets feedback on patient positioning, port placement, the surgical technical skills or the instrument use, and some critical steps of the operation. Next, this is endoscopy. We have Dr. Wei, who is a retired GI surgeon, but an extremely world-renowned surgeon who used to work at Mount Sinai, and he's in his office in Connecticut, or in his home in Connecticut. And then Dr. Joseph is on the other side. And again, as you can see from the setup, it's very easy to also implement for endoscopy. So as you can see, he gets the outside view and the inside view, and which is very crucial for endoscopic procedures, so that he can teach them exactly what to do. And here is a video of the same crew of people, except also with Dr. David, who is a fellow at that time at Mount Sinai, and teaching Dr. Joseph on how to do banding. Shoot. Sorry. And they're doing it on a glove as a practice. So at this point, we have done a large number. Dr. Joseph doesn't actually need Dr. Wei anymore because he's done so many. And we published something that's more related to looking at the impact of introducing endoscopy to this region, because previously they did not have endoscopy at all at any centers near that region. So, and we found obviously there were significant amount of endoscopic diseases, and a significant amount of esophageal cancer as well, and that people who have dysphagia had a significant chance of having esophageal cancer on endoscopy because there's no surveillance and they don't come until it's extremely advanced. And now we do some interventions such as palliative stent placement. I just want to touch very briefly on augmented reality headsets. We managed to have a HoloLens over there in Uganda, so we've done a couple cases like this. This is Dr. Taub, who is, so you're seeing the view from Dr. Joseph's HoloLens, and if you have ever used augmented reality headsets, you can have a view in your field of the other person. So this is Dr. Taub in his headset. And they're doing what's called a Hatchet flap, which is this patient had a very large tumor grown on her scalp, and they needed to remove it and do some very fine tuning of what the plastic surgeons help to close the wound. And obviously there are no plastic surgeons there, and this is why I think these kinds of things are very important, that we are able to provide these unique expertise kind of experience and guidance during these surgeries. So. And then the nice thing about this type of setup is that with the HoloLens, as well as with a lot of other augmented reality headsets, you can write on the screen and show people what it is that you want them to do. So we've done a few more cases than what was published here. At that time, it was like 6 cases. And again, it's a lot of very complex plastic surgery cases, or we've also used it in gynecology cases for very large ovarian cysts because Dr. Joseph is a general surgeon, so he needed some assistance with gyne kind of cases. And there are some issues with using the HoloLens specifically, mainly that the annotation function is not as precise as we like it for surgery. And the headset, the camera on the headset is um, I'm gonna turn on my camera so you can see what I'm trying to say. The camera on the headset is pointed directly forward as that's how it's designed for. So as surgery, you don't have to look down the entire time and it causes a lot of neck strain. And so it's not great for surgeon ergonomics. And also the contrast that the camera provides is also not great for surgery because we always have the overlight headlights and it sort of makes everything either white or black. So there's definitely certain problems with it. But there are a lot of other tools out there now that is more specific for surgery and they actually do work very well. And that's the end of my, oh wait, yeah, that's the end of my talk. And hopefully I did not go over too much, sorry.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the presentation, and we will open it up now for general discussion. So for everyone on the call, I invite you to either submit your question in the chat or to please raise your hand just so I can acknowledge and get people in queue for their questions. I'm going to start off the conversation with a question for both of you, and then open it up to the floor. And my question builds off a little bit of what Robert Riviello put into the chat, but takes it in a bit of a different direction. And then Robert, I'll let you follow up with if there's more that you want to explore there. So for both of your presentations, you've alluded to some needs in terms of infrastructure, and then also some needs in terms of technical capacity, either the technical capacity of the surgeons that you're working with or of the other folks who support the infrastructure at the facilities. And so my questions for you, for both of the types of interventions that you're supporting, what are the basic minimum infrastructure requirements that you need to see, or the minimum technical capacity requirements that you need to see to think that a facility might be ready for these interventions? And then more specifically, because we want to focus also on the research aspects of this, are there any tools to formally assess whether or not facilities are ready for these types of interventions? So any facility readiness tools that people can implement to say, yes, we're ready for telerobotic surgery. So Dr. Sekeli, we'll start with you and then go over to Dr. Zhang.
All right. So yes, I mean, that's an excellent question, actually, because that's basically the cusp of everything. We're trying to figure out what is the right way to do this. So in most of the collaborations we're doing and the studies we're doing, we're not doing it alone. So it's not a urologist coming up with what should be the bandwidth. It's mostly we are actually collaborating with the Ericsson, the telecommunication company, with one of the VPs there. He's Dr. Misha Doler. He's a professor at King College, and he basically was one of the first guys to approach us and say, hey, he's done a lot of work with musicians, broadcasting concerts virtually and all of that. So he was like, why can't we just do this in surgery, like as a service? So he came and approached us initially before all of this started. And we started working around what could be the ideal numbers that we can use, and what are the best in terms of latency, in terms of bandwidth. So he came up with the 300s, which was 100 milliseconds, 100 gigabytes bandwidth, and I think it was almost 100% reliability. So the question is, how do we achieve this? Which is a different story altogether. Obviously, when you look at what's the most reliable connection out there, it's fiber optics at the moment. And the problem with that, though, is it's super expensive and it's not available everywhere. And trying to spread that to other parts of the world, you can imagine, just probably just extra costs that a lot of people won't be ready to bear. So the next question is what is the next best thing? And 5G is what came out as 5G connections, wireless connections is what came out as the most likely contender. It's definitely not there yet. And the problem with 5G is that it doesn't travel long distances at a time. It's shorter distances, but they are pretty true to the actual data transfer or data packet loss, or what they call jitters. Well, it's pretty minimal when you using 5G. So they thought that would be the next best thing. Obviously, the ideal way would be to dedicate a network just to telesurgery that you can use without any interference from the general public, which he told me, according to him, he tried to talk about that in the UK, and they're like, this is not something that we're going to go for. And it's hard to pass that legislation. I think in China, they do have it. It is dedicated to them. So the way to do it is to try and find devices or build devices that can sort of compress the data that has to be transferred to make it transferred easier, and then decompress on the patient end, or vice versa. That seems like the next most likely solution to that. We're not there yet. We can't say confidently that we've actually solved that issue. But in terms of numbers, I think the number 100, it was actually published in one of the most recent papers we wrote about. I think it was the telesurgical technical aspects. It was published in IEE, in Journal for Engineering. So he talked in more detail about what are the technical requirements he thinks are necessary for that. So hopefully that answers part of the question.
It does. I do want to push it just a little bit more before I hand it over to Dr. Zhang. So besides the connectivity, well, with the connectivity, you said 100% reliable. So I'm just curious, how do you assess that? Like what do you need to demonstrate that something is 100% reliable?
So
and
when
then,
we,
and then let me just add on a few questions. So also with the technical infrastructure requirements, like what else needs to be there besides just reliable internet? And then the human resources and the human capacity, does there need to be some level of skills on the on both ends of the telesurgery to make this viable?
So in terms of reliability, what he looked at was, when they talk about reliability in the telecom industry, is that they look at how many times do you have an outage per year of internet, and for how long over the course of the year. And then they put that into a percentage in terms of time. So they calculate the amount of seconds or whatever it is along the year, and they look at how long there's an outage and how many times a year. And that's what they consider reliable. They want to obviously achieve over almost 100%. Now, when we talk about reliability or connection reliability, it doesn't mean that it has you have to have a glitch at the time of surgery. Just at any point in that year, or when that period of time of a year, when do you have the glitch? As long as it's more than 99.99%, to him, he thinks that might be safe enough to perform the surgery. Obviously, when we talk about having a connection, what's really important is you can't have that without another redundant connection. So the connection redundancy and having backup connections is another thing that would increase the reliability of performing the surgery on a connection basis. So that's one way. And the next question you asked, which is, what are the other parameters that we use to detect or to basically assess the technical feasibility? There's latency, there's data bandwidth, there's jitter, which is how much of the data packets are lost with the transfer of data. There's data packet loss itself. There's the visual and the haptic and the audio packet data bandwidth. So there are different bandwidths, there are different data parameters that they look at before they can assess that this is feasible to do. And another thing that I like to point out is, in the beginning, at least in the next few years, I don't see telesurgery happening without another surgeon in place to take over at some point, to at least continue the procedure, probably at not the expert level as the remote surgeon, but at least to complete it safely for the patient.
Great, thank you. Dr. Zhang, so similar questions for you about the minimum infrastructure and technical capacity to be able to implement these types of training programs. And then are there any tools to support people who want to assess whether or not they have those capacities?
Right. Yeah, it is a great question, because the ultimate outcome looks so easy, but it's really all the back end stuff that we're doing that makes it even possible. As for the technical part of it, like the internet and things like that, there is a paper that Dr. Wei had published about what is the requirements that was needed in order to do these endoscopic cases. I don't have the details. I'm also not an IT person, so I don't know what that means, but what the specifics are. But essentially for our center, recognizing that this was going to be an issue, but Dr. Marion, who's the chair of our surgery department, who is really the person who spearheaded all of this, he actually had a fiber optic, and this was in 2017, 18. He actually had a fiber optic cable dug from the Ugandan central fiber optic cable line straight to our center. And it was like a mile dig to get to the fiber optic cables there. And that was what it really ensured that we have the capacity to be able to do anything tele related. Obviously, telesimulation and teleproctoring is not as high stake as telesurgery. And I don't know if at this point, because our center has grown so much and there's so many more people utilizing our database or our internet, that now it is a little bit slower. And I notice it on our end as well when we have meetings or when we have things. So it's a very tricky situation. But to talk about other aspects of training people, you know, we don't do this anywhere else. I don't do it with SAGES at any other place, or I have never tried or even suggested doing this at any other facility because of all these limitations and in ancillary staff training. At our center, we have a IT person, we have an engineering there, and with those, they train them well so that they can set up these kinds of these tele-simulation or teleproctoring cases. So they're very familiar with it, but you really need an IT person and bioengineering person in order to do something like this. And from my work for SAGES, you know, recognizing that bandwidth is a real issue. This is why for our virtual sessions for Africa, we don't even suggest that they go live, because once they turn on their camera, then they just freeze, you know. So so this is why they just videotape their own practice, and then they submit it as asynchronous feedback from us. Whereas in Latin America, we do all these synchronous feedbacks on virtual sessions, and it's been fine. And, you know, telesimulation is a little easier to set up too, as long as you have the box and you have a camera, and you can connect it to some kind of, well, actually for Zoom, you don't even need to. You can just directly log into Zoom, and then we have the connection there.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to open it up to some questions, and just a reminder for folks as we go to your questions, if you can just introduce yourself so everyone in the seminar knows who you are. I'm going to start with Afrojiwa.
Hi, Linda and Shadi, thank you so much for speaking with us. I think both of you know me. I've been helping coordinate the session. I'm one of the fellows with the PGSSC. I really enjoyed both those talks. I've been really looking forward to hearing you both speak. I have a question that I hope is not too basic, so forgive me if it's something that I should know more about already. But that's just on the question on the kinds of procedures that you envision this being helpful for with respect to telesurgery. And I guess, like Shadi, I guess my question is primarily, when you were doing your research, if you came across any case studies where telesurgery has been used in humanitarian settings, because I think I'm struggling to visualize like the kinds of procedures which might be appropriate, like in that setting. And then I guess similarly in a rural Ugandan setting, like are the kinds of procedures that you're seeing that would benefit from having a telesurgeon in place, like are those ones that maybe are a bit unexpected? I guess my expectation would be, like in a rural Uganda, you'd be focusing on cesarean section. And from my experience, like telesurgery is most helpful perhaps in urology cases, or perhaps even in general surgery at times. So I would, if it's okay, I would love an answer. But again, I appreciate it's probably quite a straightforward question.
Yeah, Dr. Zhang, do you want to go first, or
no, you can go first on that one.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of that's a great question, because that's basically what's gonna that's what the FDA approval is going to hinge on. So, well, where's the use case in this? I mean, it's great, it sounds great, but how are we going to use it? And to us, we think the only way we're going to get it passed initially, to be able to be cleared, is if we have urgent cases that need to be done telesurgically. And we've looked at that and we've talked to people. And when we say surgery, we're using the broader sense of the term, surgical procedures or whatever it is. It's not, this doesn't definitely have to be intra-abdominal surgery. In terms of intra-abdominal surgery, Dr. Zhang might know better, but probably places where you could install a robot and do a robotic appendectomy when you don't have a general surgeon involved. You'll have the robotic component there, just a team there that knows how to set it up, at least put the trocars in. And then you'd have the surgeon dial in from somewhere else and perform that surgery on an urgent basis. But in the ones that are not intra-abdominal, I honestly think that we won't get approval for urological procedures for telesurgery before stroke interventions and cardiac and revascularization interventions, where you have to put a stent in, or when you have to try and revascularize after a stroke. Those I think will be the first cases that will get approval for telesurgery, because there is a lack of expertise to perform them in some rural areas, not just in the United States, obviously all over the world. But even within the United States, there are some states and areas that do not have access to quittable stroke care at the moment. So that's where we see it starting off in terms of urgent cases and allowing interventions that would save lives and help with actual quality of living. And when you look internationally, there are countries that probably don't even have any form of revascularization techniques, at least on the stroke end, probably in cardiac stenting. But we need to look at their success rates and trying to spread the surgical expertise broadly. And I think there are examples where they tried to perform cardiac revascularization remotely. I think they did one between two buildings far away. I know they've done it within India, and probably they've done an experiment. I might be mistaken, but somewhere probably in Hopkins. One of the cardiologists that we know that's leading this initiative is Dr. Matter. I think he works out of Detroit, Grand Rapids. He's a cardiologist that's trying to lead the telesurgical space in that.
I would respond also that I think telesurgery, it's maybe a little bit slightly more limiting as to its application versus telesimulation or teleproctoring. I think they approach this complicated barrier question in a very different way. Telesimulation and teleproctoring is about training local surgeons to build their capacity so that they are able to do these things themselves. Whereas telesurgery is more, as Shady suggested, it's like more providing surgery in areas where there's just currently no surgeons who can do the specific or the very complex surgery. So the approach is slightly different. And I would argue that for telesurgery, from the approach that telesimulation and teleproctoring is going in, there is not really a role for telesurgery, right? The amount of money that you're spending to bring a robot there and to do the surgery, you could spend that money just training the surgeon to be proficient in the procedure themselves. So there are two different pathways, and I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but they just provide different kinds of services and fulfill that gap in a different way. So, but I can see how eventually it can get to a point where it is within country telesurgery, like the surgeon in Kampala can potentially do robotic surgery on a patient at my center if they don't have that expertise there on doing that. Like that seems to make logistically more sense and better utilization of resources.
Thank you.
No, definitely.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying definitely what Dr. Zhang saying makes complete sense. I agree that right now at the space it's definitely very expensive, and it's not ready yet to be launched as a program. And it's basically only for places where you don't have the expertise. I don't think telesurgery will kick off before teleproctoring, or it becomes a very mainstream practice. There are platforms out there that really enable teleproctoring, such as Proximie and other things that basically allow for the surgeon to be available virtually, almost hand in hand with the surgeon, with the local surgeon, and that itself, I think, is how it's going to be used most of the time. Performing telesurgery itself, the actual surgical procedure, is just going to be in places where there really is no other choice. So that's how I see it actually happening.
Thank you both. I'm going to elevate a question from the chat before I go to Sal, just because it pushes on the same line of questioning, but in a bit more of a it pushes it along in a way that I think is super important for us to think about. So this is from Nebu Balingin, and please feel free to come on if you want to ask the question yourself. But in short, how much do you think telesurgery is in ensuring equitable surgical care? Can we see it more as experimental or a form of surgical tech luxury? Do you really see this as addressing health equity, or is this going to push further access to surgery amongst people who can afford more high-tech surgeries?
No, that's a good question. I think that in the beginning, it's still going to be experimental. I mean, you have to, first of all, convince the patient that you need to do a surgery on him and the surgeon is not in the room or not even in the building or in the country. So trying to convince a patient that we want to do that safely, that alone is going to take a while. And to do that, the only way that can happen is when you have data to show that it can be done feasibly, it's doing well, and that's going to take years of work. It's not going to be something that's going to happen overnight. In terms of it pushing the boundaries further for equitable care, I honestly don't see that happening, because to actually have a full set team in place performing robotic surgery is pretty expensive. But just to be able to have half a robot basically in one area, while for intervention that you need, that seems obviously a bit cheaper, and it's going to be part of the hospital package or the local hospital package, what they can offer the patient. It's definitely going to be cheaper than trying to fly the patient out somewhere to get it done, if they can do it when the patient is in place. That's how we see it. It's definitely going to be cheaper than flying him out, but will it make it will it cause the disparity to become worse? I don't really see that actually happening.
Thank you for your response. I'm going to go over to Sal Afshar.
Hi, everyone. That was wonderful. Thank you. First, I want to appreciate how complicated it is actually to operationalize this type of program, and that's the posture I'm coming, because I'd love to learn how you've dealt with some of the issues. You touched on the reliability, right, and the 4 nines, 99.99% uptime. And when we think of other standards like power for hospitals, we have the same kind of reliability needs, and then you have service line agreements with those organizations. And then you have a separate liability insurance for if there's patient harm. So I'm curious to know what is the reliability number? I think you mentioned it's the 4 nines. How did you have to get separate liability insurance from a malpractice standpoint? And then how do you manage, and I know there's a spectrum from like telepresence and telecoaching to telesurgery, but the end to end has to be locked, right? You can't be at home on your Wi-Fi, joining in with someone who's locked into a fiber optic backed up with satellite and so forth. So just love to learn how you've navigated the internal bureaucracy of your organizations to meet the liability risks and the communication with the ethics committees and so forth.
So just first off, just to be clear, we haven't actually performed telesurgery on a patient yet, either within the United States or outside. Within China, however, they are performing, and our team visited and looked at what's being done. But keeping that in mind, to answer your questions, yes, everything you brought up is absolutely key in this. When it comes to cybersecurity and authentications, we actually talk to a lot of cybersecurity firms that deal with actual data, medical data transfer, and they believe that there is the number one way, or the optimal way, is to have a dedicated line to just this that cannot be accessed, that could be locked down, but that's obviously super expensive, and you have to get government involvement, and you have to get, at least within the United States, the whole company or Verizon or AT&T or whoever to sign on for this and give you a dedicated line. The next best thing would be having encryption and authentication methods, making sure that you're doing it at times where there is cybersecurity team available from a service standpoint, meaning there is a service hub or a platform that monitors what's going on second by second to make sure that it can mitigate any issues in terms of data breaches or cybersecurity threats. And at that point, and there is a paper written that talks about the different potential cybersecurity threats that can happen during a telesurgical procedure and potential ways to mitigate or solve that. But one thing I'd like to emphasize is it's more important to prevent them than to solve them, because to solve them, that means the damage is done. and you're trying to figure out what to do afterwards. What we need to try to do is prevent them, and that's where the authentication comes in, and that's where the multi-level encryption comes in. So when you're able to provide that framework that you know is robust and works to your organization, that should help them feel a bit more secure on actually performing telesurgery. And when it comes to liability, yes, I'm pretty sure that's going to be a whole different ballgame. Tell you within the state of Florida, you can perform telesurgery. There's no law that says you cannot, but that's because probably wasn't thought about. Because you can perform within the state of Florida or to anywhere else. But what the lawyers are talking about, because there's no real guidelines written on this, what a lot of law experts are talking about, and we discussed this in one of our meetings, is what really mitigates who's responsible is what the local laws are of the patient, not where the surgeon is. So that is for now what we think is a framework that will mitigate any legal disputes later. And I'm pretty sure the liability insurance would be something completely separate that needs to be studied and done. So it's all still in an experimental phase, but this is the framework that we're actually looking at to sort of gear the discussion or trying to find solutions to these issues.
I don't really have anything to add to that one. I think the question is more for telesurgery.
Great. Well, I have a question for you before we go to the next hand raised. And I think it's one that you both can respond to, but Linda, it's particularly generated from your study. I think one of the things as a researcher that's really interesting about the work that you're doing is oftentimes when you're talking about these interventions, you have incredibly small sample sizes, right? You have one facility that might be doing the telementoring or the telesimulation, or similarly the telesurgery itself. And so as you're trying to document the impact of these types of interventions, talk about studies that include a single surgeon who's receiving the telementoring and how that's generating evidence and what you think the future of that research is.
Yeah, these are technically all pilot studies, right? Exploratory feasibility kind of studies that just sort of proves to, or shows people, it doesn't really prove, but it shows people that these kinds of telesimulation or teleproctoring can work. And I think we're certainly not at a stage, and there are very few, but there are a few other institutions that are doing this as well. And I think eventually we'll get to a stage where there can be more amassed data on this, but for now I think it's certainly in the very preliminary stages, and that is one of the limitations of all of our studies, right? It is done at one location, one surgeon, lots of resources devoted to one person to train that person to be able to do these things.
Linda, I have a question for you, if you don't mind. So if the way you see this landscape, so teleproctoring and telementoring, I think is the mainstay or the best way to be able to disseminate surgical knowledge to patients or to surgeons, sorry. So if you see this becoming more mainstream and being picked up to the point where it's a normalized clinical practice, how would you mitigate different surgical techniques being taught to different people around the world? Like, do you think it has to become standardized, or is it just every institution or surgeon teaching what they think is appropriate? So how would you see it happening?
I mean, I think right now, laparoscopic surgery, especially for certain regions, it is so non-standardized. And this is why for SAGES, we are trying to bring FLS testing to these countries, because that is a standard way of training and validation of proficiency. So I think that's the main thing for now. If people are FLS certified, then it sort of becomes the same as training residents in the US, right? Depending on which residency you go to, you might get a different technique or a different way. And surgeons are very much like, oh, I like to do my lap chole this way. I put my ports here as opposed to there. But does it really make a difference ultimately at the end? Probably not in terms of surgical outcomes. So, but certainly for the basics and the fundamentals, it is important to have that standardization. And that's why for SAGES, we're really trying to push for that for the region of Africa, just because it's the wild, wild west over there. People are just doing whatever and learning in any way they can, and it is not standardized and not proficient.
Thank you for that. Before we go to what I think is going to be the last question for today's seminar, I just want to highlight these are the results from the Menti poll. And again, a real joy for this seminar series is that by offering it virtually, we can bring in learners and experts from all over the world to learn together. So really appreciate you joining us today. In the chat, we're going to put in a survey for today's seminar session. This is really important for us to help us understand how you're engaging with this content and what content you would like in the future. So I do ask, as we're elevating this last question and answering this last question, if you can just take a minute to please respond to the form that is going to be put into the chat. And then my last announcement before the last question is our next session is going to be on April 3rd. I want to note that this is a date change. Usually we are the second Thursday of the month, but in April we're going to do the first Thursday in the month out of respect for the genocide commemoration in Rwanda. It's an exciting topic for us on the role of advocacy in global surgery. And so we would love to see you all there, and we will send out an announcement reminding you of the session in an email following the seminar. So with that, again, I want to thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Sadita Suwansiri. Please introduce yourself, and then if you can ask what I think is going to be the last question of the seminar. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sahita Sansiri. I'm a medical student from Thailand, and so I would like to first thank both speakers. I've gained a lot of valuable insights from this seminar. So yeah, and so I have two questions. For my first question, so I'm all for telesurgery. I'm really interested in this particular field, but I do have some questions regarding the social aspect for this. So during the first slides from Dr. Shady, if I remember correctly, there were a few slides on the density of expert surgeons in each regions of the world. So I'm curious as to whether us utilizing telesurgery, would this affect the workload of expert surgeons in some particular areas, and would this be increasing the workload on some expert surgeons while making some surgeons from regions where they're not as specialized? Would that make those regions be more dependent on the more dense areas? I'm not sure if I understood. I
No,
explained
I
it
understood.
clearly.
I answered your question clearly. It's it's an excellent question actually. Um, when we talk about telesurgery per se, it's not about doesn't necessarily mean that the surgeon has to perform the procedure from A to Z. So the surgeon can just chime in the key parts of the procedure that need expert hands just for optimized patient outcomes. The local surgeon could probably perform the surgery safely to the end, but probably the patient outcomes are what's going to be affected because they don't have the workload. If you look at the rest of the world, when it comes to robotic surgery or minimally invasive surgery, the sheer volume we have in the United States, and I'm sure Linda agrees, it's non-comparable. You can't have that much volume per surgeon when you compare it to anywhere else in the US. So naturally, you pick up expertise that you can't gain anywhere else. And that will definitely optimize patient outcomes. So the point is to be able to spread it. Now, if you do telesurgery multiple times where the surgeon is performing that key component of the surgery, at one point it is basically inherently telementoring, because the surgeon, the local surgeon there is going to learn that procedure at some point, because it's not like they step out of the room while the other guy does it. They're there watching what's going on through a console to figure out where exactly where they're missing, or where exactly is the point they can improve on. So that in its own will teach them. At some point, maybe telesurgery will have a huge boom, and then at some point start dying off hopefully, because we have that surgical expertise spread everywhere. But it's just the sheer volume of the huge gap involved today in terms of global surgical equity. We see that the fastest way to disseminate it at this point would be telesurgery, to try and close it initially and try and make fair and equitable healthcare available to all.
I'd also like to hear your perspective, Dr. Linda.
Okay. So I think that telesurgery is very different from telesimulation and teleproctoring. So what teleproctoring and simulation is really about building the capacity of the surgeons there. So creating less dependency on us eventually. But again, there's, I think, two different ways of approaching this, and they're both valid. And it's just a differing in, and I think that to go back to like telesurgery, I can see how telesurgery, there will always be an inequity, right? Even in the US, there's an inequity in, as Shady mentioned, between places that have fewer surgeons and and expertise versus other places. I think that making the leap, as I think Afra was mentioning, to go from a high income country all the way to a low income country, that leap seems really far and may or may not be the best utilization of resources right now. But there is a role for telesurgery, I think, even in the US, because that gap will always be there. And so, and eventually, like I mentioned, that I think seeing it as like in-country assistance to fulfill that gap is probably, I don't know, this is my opinion, where telesurgery is going to start at first, and then eventually it can reach more of the intercontinental gap.
Thank you for that. I do think we'll have to end the questions there. Sajitha, I think you might have had one second question. If you want to drop that into the chat, we can try and respond there. I'm going to let both of our speakers have a last 30-second reflection or reaction to today's session. And again, want to thank everyone for joining us today. And please complete the survey in the chat. So Dr. Zhang, why don't we start with you with any last reactions or reflections based on today's seminar?
Sure. I think I had a wonderful time talking to everyone. These are very thoughtful questions, and I think the topic itself is a very innovative, more cutting edge kind of topic of where we can potentially go to in the future. And we've also thought a lot about telesurgery, and we've been having a hard time figuring out where its role is. So thank you, Shady, for enlightening me on that topic.
Dr. Sakali,
Thanks,
last
Dr.
words. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Sang. Yeah, no, I think it was excellent. It was great. It's great that there's a lot of traction and interest in tele-mentoring and tele-surgery and basically trying to disseminate the knowledge in remote connections as possible, trying to leverage technology to promote global surgical equity in some form of sense, whether it's tele-mentoring or tele-surgery. And I read Dr. Zhang's paper, and I was really impressed as to what the efforts are what's happening in Africa, and it's really amazing. I think that's a very cost-effective and efficient way of promoting surgical expertise and trying to teach people how to train locally, especially for someone like me who's trained in Lebanon, where the actual surgical volume isn't as high as in the US. So we'd always definitely appreciate someone providing their expertise as much as possible. So the future is great. I think it's going to come there. It's going to get there. It's just we need to try and make sure technology works for us, not we work for technology. So yeah.
That's a great point to end on. Again, we're grateful for your time and expertise. So thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing everyone on April 3rd for our next session on advocacy and global surgery. Be well.
Yeah. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.